In today's filler background footage, we're running the Central Atlantic and Union Railroad. For those of you who don't know, recently I've made a playthrough specifically for live streams. It uses the Lunar Ridge custom map, has every car type, and has every industry connected, so I can do whatever I feel like doing on a stream. But there's one big catch: this playthrough follows my Steel Pegasus rule set. If you don't know what that is, here's the cliff notes. Short, realistic trains, mandatory mixed freight, a limit on cars, weaker locomotives, harsher buying restrictions. It's surprisingly fun, and if you're looking for a new way to play the game, I thoroughly recommend it. I have been loving this playthrough, even though it's basically finished at this point. If you want something easier, we also have other challenge rules and rule sets available. I'll link them in the description. Anyways, in this episode, we're running locomotive number 23, Saskatoon, as she pulls an over-length train. I somehow managed to miscalculate the train length, and we have 9 cars when we're supposed to have 8 according to the rules. Whoops, that's an honest mistake thanks to me recording this at like 2 in the morning. Sorry for you purists out there though. Our train has 3 loaded tank cars, 3 empty cordwood flats, and 1 loaded coal hopper to bring from end to end on our line. Along the way, we'll also swap stake flats at the smelter and ironworks. Anyways, onto the real content today. We have 2 stories to tell. One Dungeons & Dragons one, and No Home for a Hero, Chapter 2. I'll tell the D&D story after No Home for a Hero, because I figure a few more people are going to be here for No Home for a Hero than for the D&D story, but I think they're both fun, so we'll throw them both in. Without further ado, though, let's dive right in. Chapter 2. With a loud, bone-snapping thud, Annabelle hit the ground. She could breathe again, she could hear again, she could feel again. Somehow uninjured, she pushed herself up in a daze, the burning sensation fading into nothing, as the light of a midday sun echoed through the leaves of the forest around her and warmed the clearing which she lay in. Disoriented, Annie took a second to collect her thoughts, but too many were rushing through her mind. Where was she? Is she dead? Alive? Glowing eyes? What just happened? What did she feel? What did she think was... No. None of that. Just as Professor Maxwell had taught. Was Maxwell okay? Is Mom okay? Who's the surveyor? What even... No. One thing at a time, as she had learned. The most pressing question racing through her head was simple. What was this place? Breathing in, relaxing her muscles, purging what little was left of the pain, and looking around her, Annie realized where she wasn't home. She had seen forests before, and traveled vast distances by trail, but whichever one she had fallen upon had a signage she had never seen before. This question obviously wasn't answering itself. She was hopelessly lost. However, lost doesn't mean without something to do. As the low growl of some beast drummed up from behind her, instinct from her training kicked in, and Annie pulled the static from the skies around her to form a simple electric shield. All she needed to do was keep her composure and the shield would stand. No need to strike back yet. She didn't even know what was behind her, and something such as a burst of lightning, while effective, would likely drain her of enough energy to leave her in critical danger if something else came along to confront her. As she slowly turned around, it was quickly apparent what the source of the noise was. A bear was staring her down with a threatening pose. It didn't seem outright hostile, but it certainly wasn't happy to see her in its territory. Lightning would be too costly, a neuron pulse would be too difficult to execute on the fly, and a blinding flash would just enrage the bear. She would do what she'd always been told to do in the face of danger, even if she wanted to stand tall like her mother always could. Hold your shield, and slowly back away. Step by step, Annie's feet carried her backwards. It was relieving to be able to move on her own again, but it was anything but comforting knowing why she had to move. Keeping her eyes on the bear, occasionally glancing backwards to make sure she didn't trip, she carefully made her way away as fast as she could, careful not to enrage it or let her guard down. The bear, however, did not find this acceptable and made a mad dash towards her, lunging with all its might. Annie only had a split second to react, making the right choice. Instead of giving into her fears and running like her gut instincts told her to, she stood her ground, focusing more energy into the shield's composition to keep the bear from reaching her. Her focus was too great, however, and the shield too powerful but far too small. While it certainly slowed the bear, its size could not fully stop its lunge, and instead the pain enraged it to strike again. The shield had failed her, and Annie instead focused on blinding the bear with a flash of light, which would have been the right move to make if Annie had remembered to close her own eyes or look away. The flash burned into her mind, the world around her only a white screen. It must have hit the bear too, as it was groaning in as much confusion as she was, but they were still on an even playing field. This was still a moment she could use to her advantage, as she continued to back off and reformed the shield around her. If Annie could get distance on the bear, maybe she could escape it, or better prepare herself for the next time she would need to fend it off, and build up the focus to kill it, one way or another. Well, it would have been a great plan had she not tripped over a rock in her blinded state. The wind got knocked out of her as she hit the ground, even more disoriented than before. Fortunately, her eyesight started to return to her. Unfortunately, the bear's sight was likely coming back, too. Not a good sign, considering it was still in front of her, and it was still staring her down. But before it could charge again, a quick motion covered her vision. She couldn't make out what it was, and the bear seemed confused by it too as it stood in place. It was probably more confused about how its head suddenly fell off, though. Annie certainly was, and she let out a yelp of fear and turned her head away as to not see the bloody mess that was sure to follow. "Guess I was right," a familiar voice said in a dull tone. Annie looked up to see the surveyor holding his curved sword in his hand, stained in blood. "You're not completely useless, huh, kid?" He sheathed his blade. "Didn't get instantly mauled to death by some bear." Annie stammered. "Can it, kid? No one cares. You could be the prodigal idiot to save the world, the heir to a long-forgotten throne, a farmhand who grew up doing God knows what, but that doesn't matter anymore. Your reality's gone, and no one gives a damn." Annie couldn't even sputter out another word, just muttering incoherent phrases beneath her breath, as the reality and shock started to settle into her mind. But hey, look at it this way. Now you've got a reason to live. Someone to work for, something to do. Not gonna be wasting your time bumbling about in some school. Real experience in the field, working for me. I had... The surveyor interrupted her. "Yes, you had. This is what you have." He snapped at Annie, getting uncomfortably close to her face. He grabbed her chin with one hand and turned her head to stare directly into his eyes. "And you're gonna take it, unless you want to be forever forgotten like the rest of your stupid town." "Philip," a new voice chimed in. "I'm only here 2 minutes after you arrive, and you've already killed wildlife and started yelling at the locals. You've got to tone things down." Annie turned around to face the new voice, only to be greeted by a dragon the size of a small house. Annie had never seen a dragon before. She had only read about them in books or heard of them in her mother's stories, but this one defied her expectations, as it had a mouse-like snout, the ears of a fox, no visible mouth, and glowing yellow eyes. Its scales were mostly black, with a few highlights of a very dark midnight purple/blue shimmering where the light reflected. "Oh, so I'm not allowed to blow off a little steam?" Philip retorted, annoyed. "A little steam? Philip, every time I see you talking to someone, you're yelling, yelling, yelling!" The dragon's eyes slimmed as if it were furrowing its non-existent brow. Yeah, and the job's hard enough to warrant lots of yelling. Trust me. Trust you? Your first impression may be your last for these people. The dragon lashed out in frustration. It's your job to get as much information from everyone you can before the world ends, and if everyone's mad at you, no one's going to talk. Ain't the same for new recruits. The dragon recoiled, shocked. Philip. Yeah? This is a new recruit? Yeah? The dragon bowed its head and closed its eyes in disapproval. Philip, please tell me this isn't how you've been initiating them. He stood still, silent, the look of unamused boredom an obvious reply to the dragon's question. I just... get lost. Go harass someone else, for God's sake, not your co-worker to be. Whatever you say, he replied, and began walking away into the heart of the forest. Just before he disappeared out of sight, he turned his head and jeered a simple phrase. Rathead. We'll catch up to you when I'm done fixing your stupid mistakes. The dragon glared at Philip as he walked away. Once gone, the dragon turned to face Annie, the anger in its posture dissipating as its stance became more calming and protective. Apologetic, even. Dear, I'm so sorry you had to deal with him before I got here. Lowering itself to the ground, the dragon let out a heavy sigh. Are you okay? Annie couldn't even finish her first thought before finally bursting into tears. This was the first moment of respite she'd gotten today since breakfast, and it was anything but comfortable. She still had so many questions, yet none of the answers. None of the answers she wanted, that is. All she had were the kinds of answers that told her exactly what she didn't want to hear, and only gave her more questions to ask. I get it. The dragon spoke slow and softly, trying its best to comfort the crying girl. It's a lot to take in all at once, and if you were subject to Philip's blunt, uncaring mannerisms... Annie tried to speak through her tears, but her sorrow was draining her breath enough that she could barely get the air to mutter even the single word, No, dear, don't force yourself to speak. The dragon wrapped its wing around Annie's back, using its warm embrace to blanket her. You've been through enough already. Don't overload yourself. It let out another heavy sigh. We can talk when you're ready, okay? Take it slow. Feeling any better? It had taken Annie a good handful of minutes to regain her composure. I am, she said. It wasn't completely true. She still had more questions than answers and a dire want to return to her mother's side, but at least she had mustered the ability to speak again. Well... The dragon kept speaking with a slow, calm tone. Let's start simple. What do you want to know? She thought for a few seconds. Annie paused to look at the nearby environment. Where are we? 1A-TACA37-D. What? It's a code of some kind. A code? Annie glared at the dragon in confusion. But what does that mean? I don't know. The dragon seemed lost in thought, perplexed by the question. But I do know the D means it's quote-unquote marked for death. We're trying to... Wait. Annie interrupted the dragon. Why that? What? Why do you know that, but not the rest? Oh, silly me, I'm so sorry, dear, the flustered dragon replied. I haven't even bothered introducing myself yet. It chuckled over its own mistake. Neither have I, though. Yes, but you're the one who's lost here. You shouldn't need to be the first to do that. It stood up, stretched its wings out, took a few steps away from Annie, and turned to speak again. My name's Mordecai. What's yours? Annie took in a deep breath, the last of her fears dissipating for the time being. Annabelle, she responded. Good to meet you, Annabelle, Mordecai replied. I'm sorry this is how we had to meet, but I hope you can help us build a better future. How? Annabelle inquired. Well, you were at the Composition Access Singularity, right? The what? I think Philip, Mordecai scoffed, described it best. The hole in the heavens looks kinda like the night sky and feels like the opening to another reality. Mordecai straightened out her neck and spoke beneath her breath. I mean, that's kind of what it is, but I think I saw it. Well, we still don't know why worlds are marked for death, but something about that code. Mordecai paused. Well, someone had to make it, and someone had to make the call to kill. But Annabelle took a moment to contemplate. Why? That's the money question, Annabelle. We don't know, but we need to. I've been following it to keep the tick in the back of my head quelled, and like clockwork, 1 month passes and it's gone. Mordecai leaned over to Annie, who had a sinking feeling in her gut. And that's horrible, Annabelle replied. Exactly, Mordecai said solemnly. But, well, that's where we step in. She pridefully lifted herself off the ground. We can... Her heart visibly sank with her wings. Well, all we can do is explore every world and record it as best we can. She paused again, and a spark of hope rejoined her eyes. And, well, maybe find out a thing or two about what's going on. That's the best we can do? Sure is, kid. The silence that had risen between the dragon and the girl was broken as Philip's voice cracked through it like a brick does an egg. And if these worlds are anything like yours, he scoffed and rolled his eyes, well, let's just say our work's going to be a lot of listening and not much of anything useful. Philip, Mordecai snapped, I told you to beat it. Yeah, well, wings for brains. I didn't find any signs of anyone else around here. No stories to gather. No idiots to extort cash or info out of. Philip, we're not extorting people. Your loss, he said, mindlessly grabbing a pine cone and chucking it as hard as he could. Either way, Rat had no signs of life nearby. Mordecai looked over at the bear's corpse, which had long since stopped bleeding and was being taken advantage of by a fox, who ran off with a stringy chunk of muscle in its mouth when the dragon turned its attention in that direction. Philip spoke. You know what I mean, you pedant. Intelligent life, not including us. Mordecai glared at the gravel path beneath them and the signpost nearby. You sure? Oh, for gods. Look, no towns, no campsites, no cottages. Not occupied, at least. He kicked a rock off into a bush. Look, I'm tired. I've dealt with enough morons today to give a headache that'll last a week. I'm not looking any harder than I already have. Mordecai let out a sigh. Well, you're the one with the tent. That I am, he gleefully replied, dropping his bag off his shoulders and onto the ground. And you best bet I'm getting a good night's sleep tonight. That makes 2 of us, Mordecai responded. 3, Annabelle said under her breath. You're making your own bed, kid, said Philip bluntly. All right, that's enough of this. Mordecai rolled her eyes as best she could. I think that's all we need to share about our mission for now. Do you have any questions, Annie? Annie thought for a few seconds. No? That wasn't true, but she expected whatever she asked at this point would just leave her more confused than before when answered. Well, if you have any, feel free to ask them. Philip laughed mockingly, as if I'm going to answer every question this brat has. Philip, I'm going to be around. What? A new recruit needs the best training possible. And the best training is experience. Experience without an understanding of what it's worth is pointless. Mordecai unfurled her wings, making herself larger than before, looming over Philip like a lion to a meerkat. And I'm here to make sure she knows everything she needs. Philip stammered. His confidence, or bluntness, just wasn't there to help him here. Fine. Mordecai pulled her wings back to her sides, touting as smug of a look as she could without a visible mouth. As if you have a say in the matter. Even with tears still running down her eyes, Annie couldn't help but smirk at the situation. That night was uneventful. The three of them set up camp. Mordecai taught Annie how to put up a tent and tried to show her how to light a campfire, though Annie already knew how to do the latter with her spark mage skills. She didn't feel fully comfortable in the new environment, but at least the dragon who was larger than a tool shed was a welcoming soul. Philip, on the other hand, was still a bother. Not quite as rude as before, at least, though that was a low bar to clear. His cooking could use a little work, though Annabelle didn't dare admit that in front of him and face his wrath again. She just swallowed the burnt bear meat she'd been handed and did her best to hide her disgust. Part of her was excited. World ending? Saving people? Working with a dragon to protect the innocent? It sounded like the dream heroic story to tell when she got home. Most of her was terrified, though. Her past life was gone forever. She didn't have a home, and she still didn't even know if this was the right path in life to take. Not like she had much choice, but her goals had been shattered in every way possible. The mother she looked up to, the teachers who guided her towards her talents, the friends she knew as well as something as simple as her house was just all gone. This wasn't a dream. This was a nightmare. Not to mention the existential crisis of just how many people had died today. The amount was uncountable, and she started to doubt Philip had done a good job of surveying and getting the cultures written down before the end came. The end? Was it really the end? Everything felt like it was just beginning. She was barely on her own, and all of a sudden, the path in life she wanted to take most was forever blocked off, and all she had ever known was just nothing now? It was impossible to sleep. Aside from the fact Annie wasn't tired since she'd only woken up a few hours ago, she still had too many questions and too few answers. And above all else, there seemed to be no solution to saving worlds other than to pray it'll be different this time. That slight hope, that little dream which excited her a moment ago, was just that. A pipe dream. Millions would die before thousands could be saved. Millions probably already had been lost. There is no way you can become the protector of the innocent when no one can be saved. She was as hopeless as those she sought to protect. Exhausted from her own tears, Annabelle cried herself to sleep. This was no home for a hero. So, I used to go to a local game store for a summer camp. The game store was called Guardian Games. It's here in Portland, Oregon, and it's actually quite popular. However, I've been going for quite some time. I remember back when they were in some, back alley building that was kind of cramped. I remember the old dungeon master whose signature creature was the exploding flamingo that everybody would warn you about. And, most importantly, I remember the transition to new dungeon masters, because when that guy left, he left for college, and As the store expanded from being this back alley kind of building to a full-on, like, small Fred Meyer's or retail store, they transitioned how they handled their summer camps. There were no pre-made characters to kickstart the campaign on the first day. The first day, you would make your own with the help of the Dungeon Masters. The campaign was also now a continuous story, bridging from one summer camp to the next, constantly evolving. Which was, well, technically true with the old guy also, but the wacky antics that he did, such as having Santa Claus and an undead caramelized Leviathan TARDIS, really made it feel like every camp was its own special, unique game. Not to say the new guys did a bad job of hosting the camps, it's just that they had a more serious tone to the world building and overall experience. Now, since each camp carried the story over from the last, you were allowed to keep your old character and bring it to a new summer camp. These camps were primarily supposed to be an introduction to Dungeons & Dragons for teens and preteens, so they were balanced mostly for level 1 or 2 characters. That's what most players would be playing with. But if you were someone like me, who did multiple camps a year and came back every year, this could very quickly spiral out of control. It didn't help that the rule we were going by to speed things up was that on the 4th day of every camp, you would always level up. No matter what level you were. Our story starts on the transition from 4th edition to 5th edition. They completely restarted the story at this point, but because I had been in a few camps before, they let me translate my character from 4th edition to 5th edition. Yes, including my higher than normal level. At this point, I was only level 4 at the start of this campaign, but, well, that was more than enough. As an elven wizard, and the highest level character in that camp, I was a glass cannon. You want that army dead? I'll get 'em good. But first, hey, Ranger, you want to stand in front of that guy's line of sight so he can't shoot me? Please? You have more HP than I do, despite being 3 levels behind me. So, we make it to the final fight for this camp on day number 5. I'm now level 5, everybody else is level 2. And the Dungeon Master gives us a fight that permanently killed at least 3 of us. I don't remember the exact number, but the boss enemy was the head mechanist of an army, and he had made a giant lightning tower to rain hell from the skies. Because we were trying to disable the tower from the inside, there were giant gears that, if you got in the way of them, would crush you instantly. Well, okay, you couldn't really get in the way of them, because they were all in this one massive, and very obvious to avoid, pit in the middle of your arena. But there was a small problem. The boss enemy liked attacking by confusing players. So if we got bad rolls, some of our attacks would hit other players, and some of our moves would get us closer to the pit of instant death. And, well, with people being level 2 and having horrible stats, everyone got confused, some people killed each other, and some people walked the plank into the pit. Not me. I single-handedly brought the boss down. Not dead, unfortunately, but that's because the guy has plot armor and escaped through a dimension door with 6 health points. I honestly don't know if the Dungeon Master was prepared for me to murder this guy, but unfortunately he was prepared enough to save him. But he took me aside for a second and said, specifically, "You were the only player to deal damage to this boss, and you dealt over 115 points of damage." On top of all that, we had to shut down magical computers to blow up the place. Since our quote-unquote hacking attempts into those computers required arcane checks to complete, I was the perfect candidate, being the over-leveled wizard of the group. So, once the boss enemy left, I shut them down in quick order. Unfortunately, I didn't get to play anymore that summer. I didn't sign up for any more camps, but I did get to play the next year. On the first day of camp, all returning players are taken to another room to do a special single mission quest that's a little higher level, while the newcomers make their characters. When I sat down at the special quest table, one of the frequent members who recognized me asked a simple question. "Have you fought the metal men yet?" I responded, "The what now?" Everyone turned to stare at me, and the guy who asked the question asked, "You're the one who's responsible for these annoying things, and you haven't even fought one yet?" So, as it turns out, that guy who had plot armor that I beat up earlier, as the lead mechanist of that army, he made special robots just to beat me. Oh, and also some of the other higher level players here and there, but primarily me. I think that was a wake-up call for the Dungeon Masters, that throwing in these higher level characters into these low level campaigns can seriously derail things if they're not careful. And so to compensate for that, they started adding in higher level enemies that would force us to play differently. For example, these metal men were more resistant to magic and magic items. Well, most of the higher level players have magic items, and the newcomers don't. So when I got into the fray of this fight, I couldn't do anything. They were immune to my fireballs, my magic missiles did barely any damage, and my lightning bolts did barely any damage. I was not a glass cannon. I was glass, but I was more like a shard on the floor that somebody almost stepped on, with a steel-toed boot. But I had another trick up my sleeve. You see, we were still doing that kind of mission where we had to hack and shut down a couple of those monitors. And again, as the resident mage at the highest level, I was very easily able to do that. And to make matters even better for myself, and worse for the Dungeon Masters, I had invisibility and teleport. So all I had to do to beat the mission was just spam that and get to all of the monitors. I don't remember how quickly we beat it, but once I realized that, it was surprisingly fast. Now, if the metal men weren't a red flag that they were trying to kill me, this next part of the story is, because we had a camp where we joined forces with a gnome who had a massive war machine. It dealt 50 damage plus 1d100 every time it attacked. It was overpowered, and as we entered the 5th day and got to see it in action in our final climactic battle for the week, the hordes of enemies the Dungeon Master threw our way was easily plowed through by the behemoth. So easily, in fact, that we got to the magic mutation crystal pretty quickly. See, we were assigned to take out another machine of some kind. This one was basically just magical radiation on steroids, as anyone within a certain radius of the mutation crystal would, well, get mutations, whether or not you wanted them. Some were good, but others not so much. Some people grew extra arms, others got syphilis. I, personally, just had my race changed from elf to dragonborn and got a third eye. Hilariously, that eye gave me passive arcane checks and bonuses to arcane checks. How convenient, I'm the wizard. If that crystal wasn't enough of a sign that they wanted me dead, the twist villain sure was. Once the Warmech got the mutation crystal removed from the machine, he immediately turned on us. And, as the Dungeon Master later revealed at the end of the session, it was supposed to be a total party kill. He had an attack that, at base, would deal 150 damage. Nobody even had like 50 HP in this group. However, the Dungeon Master had failed to account for one character who had ball bearings that, upon hitting a target, would expand and trap said target in a bubble that anyone could lift and throw with ease. The bubble would disappear after around 10 minutes, but that would be enough time to escape whatever problem you had. This guy shot the Warmech, trapped it, and since we were on a bridge over a large body of water, he just threw it in. Disaster averted. Especially since the DM also revealed that at the end of that first turn that he had turned on us, every player was in the exact positions necessary that the dwarf could just kill everyone instantly. So, last day of my last summer camp. It's my last because I had turned 16 that year, and the DMs only let me in because I was 15 when I signed up, which is the age limit for these summer camps. I partially think they wanted another chance to kill me, but also think they were doing it out of legitimate kindness. I was one of their most active players after all, and it would be nice to go out and end things off on a big bang. And boy oh boy, did we end with a masterpiece. Our final battle begins in a volcano. There's a power station here with a bunch of those computer terminals we have to turn off. Or, well, I guess I should say, I have to turn off. My arch nemesis with plot armor, the Mechanist, shows up to stop us. And, of course, he targets me. Nobody can damage him, which isn't much of a surprise. Nor is it a surprise that he's immune to my attacks, too. Magic Missile, Counterspell. Fireball, outright immune. Lightning Bolt, protective armor. Alright, screw this. It's time for me to just teleport and do that thing where I turn off the monitors while invisible. Well, it turns out he's prepared for that too, and has set up booby traps that mind control the hacker if they fail a saving throw after hacking. On my first terminal, I get mind controlled. Before anything can happen though, I break free of it. On my second, I shrug off the attempt just fine. On my third, I fail, and get mind-controlled again. Fortunately, though, that was the last terminal I needed to disable. Unfortunately, we had run 30 minutes past our scheduled end time, and the Dungeon Masters needed to end things. Right now, there were impatient parents standing around. And so, to solve this really quickly and simply, the DM turns to me and asks a simple question. Hey, can I have your character sheet? I don't know what's happened since then, other than a couple of reports from friends at school saying that, yeah, there was a dragonborn with a third eye who was a major villain going around murdering people, and they were level 11, which happens to be the level that I was when I left the camp. I don't know what's really happened to the character anymore, because it's been 5 years since I got that news from my classmates, but I can tell you this, I at least left an impact. I gave a headache for the Dungeon Masters when I was playing, and I gave a headache for the players after I had left. And you know what? I think that's the best thing you can do for a Dungeons & Dragons summer camp. Okay, maybe that's not entirely true. I'm sorry if any of the Dungeon Masters watch this video. I I hope you guys were at least able to somehow keep things on the rails. Anyways, that's all I've got for you today. Yeah. Have a nice one, I guess. Cheers, folks.